Thank you so much and welcome to everyone to this special Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Center partnership event and the first event of 2021. We are so happy to see, as Kath said before, many of you that joined us in the many webinars that we held weekly in 2020. And we offered, as you know, a wide range of content, which is all available to you on our YouTube channel. And we invite you that if you missed any of the webinars last year, and they were very diverse, from virtual tours to art sessions, to memory sessions, many sessions about the Holocaust, many sessions about displaced persons and life after the Holocaust. All those are available to you on our YouTube channel. It is also really wonderful to see many colleagues, many friends from other Holocaust and genocide centers and museums around the world. I see our friend Rachel from Yad Vashem, Maydeen from Ghetto Fighters House, Mary Kluk from the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center, and many, many other friends. I also want to say a warm welcome to Pinchas Guta, a Holocaust survivor from Toronto, Canada, and a good and dear friend of our center. We are excited to launch our webinar program for 2021, and specifically in partnership with University College London and with the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Center that we partnered in many, many events in 2020. The next webinars will include also many interesting virtual tours, lectures, art, poetry, and more. And our next webinar is on the 19th of January, and it will be closer to home, a virtual tour of Soweto and learning about the history of human rights very close here to Johannesburg. Also, I want to mention the 27th of January, 2021, where we will love to see you all joining our commemoration of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation, the 3 centers in South Africa, to mark Holocaust Remembrance Day, and of course, the day Auschwitz was liberated. We started the theme of liberation, displacement, and life after the Holocaust, as I said, with an excellent lecture by Professor Shelly Gilbert. And tonight, Professor Gilbert will lead us again to explore more about this topic. Someone shared the screen by mistake. If Kath can, thank you very much. Please make sure that you don't press the share screen button by mistake. So as I said, we started the theme of DP camps with Professor Shelly Gilbert, and we continue tonight in this webinar. For this webinar, we have found our long lost brethren, Jewish and Christian army chaplains of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, will feature the presentation by John Levy and by Rob Thompson. But to introduce the topic, to facilitate the evening, I would like to introduce to you a friend of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, Professor Shelly Gilbert. It is an honor to work with Shirley again, and she's of course no stranger to you, the audience that followed our webinars last year. So let me briefly introduce her to you, and she will take the program forward. Professor Shelly Gilbert is a professor of modern Jewish history at University College London and heads the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Center. She has written extensively on Holocaust, racism, and memory, and was part of the curatorial team of the permanent exhibition of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. Shelly, please lead us into tonight's fascinating discussion.
Thank you so much, Tully. As always, it is so lovely to be here, and lovely to have a wonderful big crowd from all over the world. And I wish you a very warm welcome to tonight's talk, which is part, as Tully said, of an ongoing partnership between the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, the Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies at UCL, and the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Center. The Sir Martin Gilbert Centre was established in memory of the late British historian, and our aim is to bring the best historical research to non-academic audiences. We offer a wide range of accessible academic lectures, conversations, and courses around the topics of modern Jewish history, the Holocaust, and the World Wars, and I've put a link in the chat if anyone's interested in checking out some of our current events. In particular, I will give a little plug to a course that will be running on Britain and the refugee crisis in the 1930s and 40s, which will be starting on Sunday and promises to be excellent. And I will also be giving a talk next week on Music on the Brink of Destruction, which is looking at a wide range of musical activities in the Nazi ghettos and camps, including some rare post-war recordings. So please do check out our events. You would be very warmly welcome at all of them. In tonight's talk, we're going to be exploring Jewish and Christian army chaplains at the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. And I'm really delighted to introduce the two fascinating speakers who will be bringing this very important history to life, and thank them very much for giving of their time to speak with us tonight. Rob Thompson is a Wolfson Foundation PhD scholar in the Hebrew and Jewish Studies Department at UCL, where he's researching Christian encounters with Holocaust survivors in post-war occupied Germany. Before he started his PhD research, Rob was for 4 years the senior program manager at the Council of Christians and Jews, which is the UK's leading forum for Jewish-Christian relations. And while he was there, he was responsible for the CCJ's Holocaust education programs. Rob has really made a fantastic contribution to interfaith relations and Holocaust education in the UK, and he was very deservedly recognized a couple of years ago with a 21 for 21 award, which was sponsored by the Jewish News, British Muslim TV, the Church Times, and Coexist House in the UK. John Levy, who will also be speaking to us, is a sociology graduate of Bedford College, London University, and he is now the honorary director of the Academic Study Group on Israel and the Middle East, which is an educational charity that sends speakers to audiences across the UK, promoting an informed understanding of Israel and the Middle East. John's late father, the Reverend Dr. Isaac Levy, was for many years the senior Jewish chaplain, having served in the Middle East and Europe during World War II, and particularly for tonight's purposes at Bergen-Belsen in 1945. And as Kat said earlier, John and Rob are very happy to take questions after their talk. So please feel free to send your comments and questions to me in the chat throughout the talk, and I will convey them afterwards. Before I turn to John to start, I wanted to say just a few brief words of introduction to establish the broader historical context on which they will be focusing. I know for some of you, the history of the Holocaust is probably more familiar than it is for others, so I'll be relatively brief just to establish the larger context. So Bergen-Belsen was established in 1940 as a prisoner of war camp, and only a few years later became a concentration camp. In particular, it was used in 1944 and early 1945 as a collection center for survivors of the death marches. These so-called death marches were forced evacuations that were organized by the SS, in part in order to avoid large numbers of inmates from falling into Allied hands as the Allied armies approached, especially from the east, the Red Army approaching from the east in the autumn and the winter of 1944. Bergen-Belsen therefore became exceptionally crowded towards the end of 1944 and early 1945 as all of these evacuated prisoners arrived, and the conditions in the camp deteriorated, especially in the final months of the war. So when the liberating British forces finally arrived on the 15th of April 1945, what they found was absolutely horrifying. They found about 60,000 surviving victims, in addition to thousands of bodies lying unburied around the camp. They found about 60,000 people alive, many of them suffering from severe disease, starvation, malnutrition, no access to water or basic sanitation, a truly horrific situation. And the information and footage and images of this situation that came out of Belsen overwhelmingly shaped Western and especially British perceptions of what later became known as the Holocaust. Now, the first priority of the British authorities and the British military that came in was to bury the dead. Alongside that, they had to work to contain the spread of disease, to provide food and water for those who seriously needed it, and many additional military and civilian personnel were brought in to support this relief effort, which of course was a huge challenge. In fact, nearly 14,000 of those prisoners who had been alive at the liberation died after the liberation. I'm going to play for you now a very brief clip, about 3 minutes long, which contain the recollections of Belsen by a survivor who later came to South Africa, and includes some of the footage of the liberation, just to give you an image and a sense of the historical context.
The British liberated us. I don't know exactly the date, but it was April, I think. It was April already, it was pretty late, 1945. I remember seeing the tanks coming in with the British soldiers. We were overjoyed, but we were so sick and so weak that we couldn't even enjoy it. I remember I was sitting outside, there was a little bit of sun. I weighed about 40 kilos, if that. I was just not recovering, still the typhus, and I saw everything like through a haze. But I remember it well, I saw these tanks coming in. They actually rode through the camp. They saw these mountains of dead bodies, and the rest of us were sick. And it was just a sight that I'm sure none of those soldiers will ever forget. Obviously, I was happy that this horrible war is behind, but then the realization dawned on you, where are you now? You've lost everything, practically. At that stage, I didn't know whether any one of my family members had survived. I knew that my father, my older brother, was dead. I knew, well, perhaps 90% that my younger sister didn't survive. And I didn't know where my mother was, and I didn't know if my younger brother survived. Now here I am in Bergen-Belsen, sick, weak, alone, and sort of, why me? Why did I? What am I going to do now? There was nothing there. It was desolation. It looked like today I can compare it to one of these futuristic films where everything was annihilated. There's nothing left. Bergen-Belsen in 1945 was a sight I will never forget as long as I live.
And with those images in our mind, I will turn now to John Levy to start us off. Go ahead, John.
Good evening, everybody. On the 15th of April, 1945, my late father was the senior chaplain to the British Liberation Army. He'd been in uniform throughout the war, and he was to remain in Germany through till late October of that year, addressing the needs of British and Allied soldiers, but working very largely on issues to do with Bergen-Belsen. You'll forgive me if this presentation is slightly autobiographical where my father is concerned, but I must tell you that when Dad returned to Britain at the end of the war, he, like so many others who'd seen this traumatic condition, attempted to restore a normality to his life as quickly as possible, returned to ministry, rebuilding family, myself, my sister born after the war. And the issue of Belsen sort of faded very largely. I mean, all of us grew up knowing that father had witnessed the horrors of the camp, but the issue was barely discussed, apart from regular communications from Jossels Rosensaft, who'd been the organizer of the Polish and Jewish remnant who survived the camp, apart from the occasional visits from survivors who turned up in London presenting themselves, a glorious lady, Tzipora Shabbat from Petah Tikva, who made contact and who remained a close personal friend till she passed away. And the issue really only became a burning concern in the 60s and the late 70s, when Holocaust denial and historical revisionism began to emerge very dramatically. And my father, as somebody who had been witness to so much of this, really came out of his corner then, seeing red, saying, we have to ensure that this memory is not lost. He rarely talked about it. He rarely lectured about Belsen, though he did produce in 1995 a book called Witness to Evil, a short description of what he had encountered in the camp. But I can only offer you fragments of what I know of that experience because, as I say, he revealed precious little. So let me put the whole thing into context. When war started in 39, my father was 29 years of age, completely non-party political. Yet on the issue of fascism, he was the most vocal and outspoken individual, getting up on a soapbox in Speaker's Corner to inveigh against the dangers of fascism, mindful very particularly of the existential threat this posed towards the Jews. As soon as war broke out, my father was the very first serving minister to vacate his pulpit and to volunteer to go into the forces as a chaplain. So he had about a year serving, training soldiers across the UK. And then in 1941, and this has real resonance for those of you in South Africa, he was on a troop ship that took him to the Middle East, a ship that literally sailed around Africa, stopping in East South Africa in Durban, then sailing northwards through the Suez Canal to Cairo. And Dad was based in Cairo and Jerusalem. Those were the admin hubs for a 3-year period, though most of his ministry was actually out in the field in the Western Desert. He was a passionate Zionist, and he engaged with some of the luminaries of early Palestine, the Herzog family, many of the leaders of the Yishuv. Well, in 1944, mid-44, he came home, his period in the Middle East at an end. My mum always said to me that he thought the war was over for him. And on the 30th of September, 1944, he was on a troop ship back to Dieppe in France, attached to the Liberation Army, and stayed in uniform for the period thereafter, going with the frontline troops through Eastern France, through Belgium, through Holland, into Northwest Germany. And along the way, seeing all the intimations of the final solution. His job may have been to serve British soldiers, but he was aware throughout that he had to reach out to She'erit Israel, the remnant of Israel. And then terrifyingly, he saw and recorded much of what he had seen. You know, like going through Brussels, a city which before the war had a population of over 44,000 Jews, denuded of that Jewish population, over 29,000 deported to their deaths. Jews emerging from hiding, desperate for the chaplain to somehow reach out to their displaced relatives to try and help them find them, desperate to find their kids, many of whom had been boarded with Christian families. Then passing with troops through abandoned transit concentration camps, Fort Brendonk in Belgium, through Camp Vught in Holland, being on the edge of Germany in Nijmegen, where he searched out the local shul and asked people in his sort of primitive Middle European German, where is the Jüdische Kerk? And found a building smashed to smithereens. And then the British Army crossed the Rhine early April 1945 with the arrival of British troops in Belsen on the 15th of that month. Dad's junior colleague, a very ebullient minister by the name of Leslie Hardman, was the first person in Dad to follow him a couple of days later. And if I may read just a short segment from Dad's report, a letter that he wrote to the Jewish press in London, just to raise awareness back in the UK of this new horror. He writes, "My colleague, the Reverend Leslie Hardman, has been here since the second day of liberation. I joined him a few days later. Together, we're helping the military government to bring some order into appalling chaos. There are two camps. Number one, the horror camp. The stench reaches to high heaven. Death stalks abroad. Thousands have died already in these last few days. Daily, the toll rises. To date, we have buried some 20,000 men, women, and children, and more are to follow. The medical authorities are fighting a hopeless battle. Typhus is raging furiously, as are TB and dysentery." Shelly has already said the military set up the most extraordinary medical relief program. Dad always talked of the saintly Brigadier Glyn Hughes, who was the overall manager of the medical relief effort, and his deputy, Colonel Johnson, a remarkable man. They dealt with the business of triaging the fit, the sick, the dying, and working out a program whereby the fit were moved as quickly as possible out of the fetid barracks, and the sick were attended to, they were deloused, and as far as possible, patched up so they could then be moved to a hospital to be treated properly. The dead, sadly, awaiting their terrible fate. What did the chaplains then do? And only 2 chaplains, and really only a handful of other Jewish chaplains, were actually ever to join that cohort in Belsen during the period of rehabilitation. Well, I suppose it fell into a number of different fields of activity. First of all, they had to reach out to individuals and offer them sheer humanity, comfort, warmth, and in a sense, inculcate a will to stay alive. Then as Dad, who was the CEO, as it were, of the chaplains, had to raise awareness back home in the UK of this quite unprecedented disaster. And I have to tell you that from what the little I've read, it was apparent that both Gentiles and the Jewish community alike found it almost impossible initially to accept that anything as grotesque and terrifying as Belsen had actually taken place. Colonel Johnson, as I say, running a surgical unit, came back to Britain in May 45, and he recorded in his diaries that he attended a movie tone news reel in the cinema. And there were images of Belsen in the news broadcast. And he heard 2 women sitting in front of him saying dismissively, "Oh, I suppose they put those bodies like that for the picture effect." And Johnson was, as you can imagine, mortified by this. Then Dad had to appeal for hands, for volunteers. The military medical team was relatively small, grotesquely overworked, and there was a need for outside volunteer groups, and indeed Quakers and all Jewish relief teams and others did come into the camp to render support. But it was not just physical hands, but it was basic necessities. It was clothing that was needed to restore a measure of humanity to the survivors. And once a measure of stability had been restored, then as clergy, then they had to start rerunning services for those who were of a religious dispensation, whilst all at the same time engaging in massive letter writing to assist people to, as it were, re-engage their families if they could be found. And any number of sort of subsidiary problems emerged in the course of the few months it took for the camp to come alive again. Sort of rather sad and quirky problems, if you like. Number one, many of the young women fell pregnant very quickly. As soon as they get a sense back of their humanity, they also enjoyed a sense of their new sexuality, but didn't always know how to handle it. And indeed, there were hundreds of children born in the camp out of wedlock. And then there were couples who sought to get married. Father and some of the other chaplains, I think, disobeyed the directions of the London Beth Din, who said, you should not formally sanction any marriages simply because we can't establish where family relations have gone in the displacement that is Europe. I think the chaplains allowed their own discretion to judge whether folk were allowed in practice to marry. And then there were bitter engagements with the British military authorities. I've already said some were totally heroic, but others were, I suppose, bureaucratically military. I mean, fancy quartermasters railing at Jewish women who took the blankets they'd been issued with and cut them into dresses, albeit dresses over-stamped WD, War Department. As far as they were concerned, as far as the military was concerned, this was somehow abusing crown property. That's trivial by comparison with the infinitely more problematic issue of what was to happen to folk who had survived the camp and where they would go after their health had been restored. The military mind said, this is a camp, not exclusively, but largely Jewish, made up of nationals from Hungary, Czechoslovakia, France, Holland, and other countries. Once we've got people back to rude good health, they should go back to their countries of origin, and they began to assemble people in cohorts. Some of the Jewish folk were happy to go back to their countries of origin. But for the very large cohort from Poland, there was simply no question whatsoever of going back to that wilderness. And for people like Jossel Rosensaft, who had been a young Polish militant and activist, as far as he was concerned, he wished the remnant of Jewry to be defined as a separate national group. He continuously and unreservedly would only address the British authorities in Yiddish. And he created a whole cultural environment in which the Jewish element rebuilt its sense of Jewish persona in terms of setting up schools and setting up yeshivot and setting up services, Yiddish newspapers and whatever. But as far as they were concerned, they were not disposed to be sent back to Poland. And if you allow me one further reading from Dad's writings, this is from the 9th of May, 1945. That's one day after VE Day, after the war came to an end. And my father, who wrote regularly to my mum, Tony, in London, writes, I have had a hell of a day again, and so many high hopes have been dashed to the ground. I had an interview with a brigadier at main headquarters. I asked to see him, and he realized that I wanted to talk about Belsen camp. I was called to place proposals before a special meeting, which he was holding with heads of department, but I got no satisfaction. On the contrary, after the meeting, he saw me privately, informed me in no uncertain terms that my first duty lay towards the men of the army, quote, that was what I was being paid for. And though humanity was involved in the camps, I was not to devote all my time to them. I'm afraid, he said, my pleas are in vain. They make me so brokenhearted. The army demands I devote all my time to troops and leave Belsen alone. They do not see our problem. The Jewish angle does not receive attention. I've placed a scheme before them for a Jewish transit camp for these people and thus prevent them from being sent off with their co-nationals. The Poles hate the Jews still, and anti-Semitism is visible in the camp itself among the victims. Can I be more explicit? Remember the Žid expression with all its adjectives? They are heard here still. But can I make the Brits understand? I talk of food, and they feel I'm speaking from bias. Diet not good enough, people can't eat the food. And the brigadier replies to me, well, he hates bully beef, but has had to eat it for 5 years. I feel at times I'm fighting a losing battle, he writes. Well, he stuck it out till October. And in the course of those months, the barracks that made up the core camp of Belsen were fired by the British authorities. A DP camp for that cohort of Jews gradually grew as all sorts of folk from outside Belsen gravitated towards the camp. Jossel Rosensaft was orchestrating a camp of over 10,000 people by September of 1945. And actually, I have to tell you that the very last of those DPs was not actually relocated to safe homes, whether in Israel or in the free world, till 1950. For my father, he left in October 45, as I said before. Life had to return to some measure of normality. But I do have to say to you that I think if Dad was alive today, I think he'd be utterly mortified. I think he would be totally horrified at the widespread ignorance about the Shoah, basic ignorance about it. I think he would be angered beyond measure by the orchestrated voices of Holocaust denial. And he would be alarmed as can be by the reappearance of naked fascism and anti-Semitism in public life. I think Primo Levi summed it up so incredibly pithily and powerfully. Primo Levi said, "The plague is over, but the infection spreads." So the story of Belsen is as timely and important an historical memory as could possibly be.
Thank you, John. And Primo Levi's analogy could also not be more timely. I'm going to turn now over directly to Rob to give us the perspective of the stories of Christian chaplains in the same place.
Thanks so much, Shirley, and good evening, everyone. It's a real privilege to be with you this evening. Thank you so much to the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre and the Martin Gilbert Learning Centre. It's a privilege as well to speak alongside my friend John, as ever, and to hear him speak about his father, Isaac Levy. So we've heard about the experience of a Jewish chaplain, one of the two most prominent Jewish chaplains working, ministering at Belsen after its liberation. And I'm going to share something now of the story of some of those Christian chaplains who also ministered at Belsen. Christian chaplains of various denominations within the church, who worked with the ambulance units, the hospitals, and military units in the days, weeks, and months after Belsen's liberation. And I want to begin actually with Rabbi Isaac Levy, because John's father arrived at Belsen, as we've heard, not actually on his own, but in the company of a Roman Catholic chaplain colleague. And I find this image a really powerful one, because just as Rabbi Levy stood alongside Christian chaplains in the burials of those mass graves at Belsen, so too his first glimpse of the camp was alongside a Christian too. And he wrote home to his wife, John's mother, and said this: "I have just returned from my first visit to the death camp of Belsen, of which you may have read in the press. It was a long drive, and fortunately managed to scrounge a lift with my Roman Catholic colleague, who also went there. It is the showplace of the army, and the number of spectators is growing. They probably go to see what such a place looks like. I, who have seen two others which had been emptied of their victims, went to find Jews. And God did I find them." So wrote Isaac Levy. As we've heard, there were two principal Jewish chaplains operating at Belsen in the early days after its liberation. And in the course of my research, which began as an MA project and is now forming the basis of my PhD, I've been able to discover the names of 30 Christian Army and Royal Air Force chaplains, mostly British, but also some Canadians, and there are a few of them pictured here, who were at Belsen at its liberation. And their ministries at Belsen are important for us to consider, because they're a unique example of how Christian clergy were forced to respond in its immediate aftermath to what would become known as the Holocaust. And this evening, I'd like to focus on just one of those chaplains, the Reverend David Stewart, who was a Church of England priest, whose parish was in Suffolk in Eastern England. Here he is pictured with his wife after the war in the 1950s. And by focusing on Stewart's experience, I want to briefly explore three things. The first is, what did chaplains do? What did Christian chaplains do at Belsen? Secondly, how did chaplains interact with survivors, and specifically with the Jewish identity of most of those survivors? And thirdly, how did chaplains respond to the experience? And in doing so, we'll find that chaplains developed a very particular form of pastoral care, which centered around the importance of enabling survivors to tell their stories. And as a consequence of listening to these stories, chaplains recognized and articulated survivors' Jewish identity. They understood the distinctiveness, to a large extent, of Jewish suffering under Nazi persecution. And finally, Stewart's particular attention to the testimony of those he met characterized how chaplains responded to Belsen and how they articulated to others the truth of what they witnessed. So firstly, what did the chaplains do? Well, as we've heard already, in the typhus-ridden environment of newly liberated Belsen, burials were one of the most important of chaplains' duties. The tens of thousands of bodies needed to be buried as quickly as possible, partly as a public health emergency, but also to maintain some sort of dignity for those who were left. And the image of chaplains standing over those mass graves was an important one in framing, ever since, the public image of chaplains in 1945. Photographs of chaplains at mass graves being printed in the British newspapers, for example. But as important as this task was in the first days, there were, as time went on, other tasks which chaplains undertook. And the Reverend David Stewart arrived at Belsen with the 35th Casualty Clearing Station on 14th of May 1945, so already a month almost after the liberation. The mass burials, the horror images which we are so accustomed to in our perception of the camp, these aspects often reflect those early days and weeks after the liberation. By the time Stewart arrived, the situation was a little bit more settled, and Stewart worked every day in the hospitals which were established to care for the survivors. As an army chaplain, Stewart and the other chaplains were not soldiers, nor were they doctors. Stewart was, in all senses of the word, a pastor who had volunteered for service as a chaplain in January 1940. He, as Isaac Levy did, no one forced them, no one conscripted the clergy. They were reserved occupations. They could have sat out the war at home. But Stewart volunteered and for service as an army chaplain in January 1940. But he was totally, even after 5 years of war, totally unprepared for the reality of Belsen. In the days following the end of the war, and before arriving at Belsen, he described in his memoir ample spare hours where he lazed under the trees of an orchard. And occasionally, he said, a visiting officer would talk of Buchenwald and Belsen. We listened a little skeptically. However, by the time the first survivors arrived at Stewart's hospital at Belsen on the 17th of May, Stewart was confronted with the reality of Belsen. The first survivor he met was a 32-year-old woman whose husband and 2 children had been murdered in Auschwitz. Stewart described his purpose as a task with therapeutic value, armed with a German to English dictionary and the determination to understand the needs of patients. Stewart sought to induce our patients to talk of their experiences and to help them to realize that they need never again fear the recurrence of those evil things. In particular, Stewart encouraged storytelling, And in doing so, he helped survivors to rebuild a sense of connection between the life before the catastrophe and the life to come. Stewart helped survivors to write letters to their surviving relatives. He encouraged people to talk to him and to share their stories, and he listened. And the pastoral support Stewart offered was extensive, and he eventually formed relationships of care with those survivors, helping in both their mental and physical recuperation. After numerous meetings and conversations with Marieka, a young Polish woman from Warsaw, for example, Stewart wrote that one day I told Marieka, if you could only straighten your legs, you could walk. So she began to make the effort. Every day she forced her knees down, ignoring the pain until she could do it 12 times. In a fortnight, she was able to stand. In another week, she walked. And for me, that period of time that Stewart cites, the photograph he published of Marieka, which you can see here with the caption, standing for the first time in 4 months, suggests an intimate involvement in the mental and physical care of the survivors of Belsen. Stewart described another of his patients as the girl who did not want to live. Her name was Magda. And when Stewart first encountered her, she would lie in bed, pretending to sleep, refusing to speak to anyone. Another survivor told Stewart that it was because she doesn't want to get better. She prefers to die. Stewart resolved to speak to her. And the next day, Magda kept her eyes firmly closed, but he began to talk to her. And eventually she opened her eyes and began to speak. And Stewart remembered part of that conversation. What do you want to talk to me about? I want you to tell me about yourself, said Stewart. There is nothing to tell. I am just a Jew from Hungary. My family is dead. I am alive, unfortunately. There is no one in the world to care whether I live or die. It would be better for me to die, for I think God himself has surely forgotten me. No, Magda, God has not forgotten you, and there are many who will be glad you lived. She gave a short, bitter laugh. Who are they? People you will meet when you go back into the world again. But if I don't go back, I shall not meet them, and how can they be glad or sorry? Well, I shall be very glad if you get better. Bit by bit, she told me about herself, and Stewart shares some of that story. He brought several others to see her, taking care to choose those with a cheerful nature and firm character, he said. To my joy, one of them became her fast friend. She too had no relations. When I left Belsen, she was convalescing rapidly. Some of the language in Stewart's report that he wrote can sometimes seem a little distant. Sometimes it's perhaps even sensationalized. Sometimes he repeats some of the sort of horror stories which characterize so much of the contemporary engagement with Belsen. But those examples are almost always instances where Stewart is sharing the experiences of others from the early days of the liberation, something he himself did not actually witness. His account of his own personal experiences are far more personal, and his encounters with patients, I think, display a deep sense of respect, such as his response to a non-Jewish German former inmate of Ravensbrück, who weeps at the realization that she will never see her mother again. To this, Stewart wrote, "What could one say in the face of such grief as that? Here was sacred ground." By spending time with a survivor, encouraging them to talk and to tell their story, and crucially by being there to listen, the chaplain was able to make a strong contribution to the survivor's ability to regain their strength and their preparedness to resume a life post-liberation. Listening helped survivors to articulate something of their experience. It gave them a sense of friendship and fellowship, and it helped them to reconnect with themselves and with others. And this brings us to the second aspect of chaplains' experience at Belsen, their interaction with survivors, and especially their interaction with the Jewish identity of those survivors. Contemporary responses to Belsen's liberation often downplayed the Jewish identity of most of those liberated. The historian Joanne Riley has noted, for example, how few of the soldier liberators of Belsen were able to comprehend something just so horrific and could not place itself within anything wider that we would come to know as the Holocaust. The Jewish story was therefore neglected, and this was also true for the way in which most of the Christian church responded to the liberation of the concentration camps. Scholars have generally agreed that for the liberators and for British society more widely, Belsen was a universal, not Jewish experience. Tony Kushner, another historian, has argued that British society characterized a context in which the persecution of the Jews was conceived in a generalized liberal attitude, which opposed religious and racial intolerance, but which could not comprehend specific anti-Semitism. And so Jews were absent from those reports of Belsen. And that's the same, historians have argued, in a Christian framework as well. But Christian army chaplains at Belsen were different because they met Jews who survived Belsen for themselves. They witnessed Belsen for themselves. The vast majority of the survivors were Jews, and in fact there were far more Jewish survivors of Belsen than at any other concentration camp liberated by the Western Allies. David Stewart unequivocally recognized and articulated the Jewish identity of those he cared for. He recorded that his hospital took in 1,870 patients. About 60 to 65%, he said, were Jewish, mostly from Hungary and Poland. And as we'll go on to have a look at, Stewart's account is interesting, particularly for his inclusion of some of the testimonies of those survivors he met. And he shared 13 individual stories from his experience. Most of those he described were Jewish, and where they were, he did say so. By engaging on a pastoral level with survivors, Stewart could understand something of Jewish experiences, both at Belsen and before. After all, large numbers of those at Belsen were survivors of the forced death marches from Auschwitz and elsewhere in the winter of 44-45. So they could tell much of the realities of Nazi persecution beyond the horror of Belsen. Stewart wrote at one point that one could always detect the Jewish patients by the number neatly tattooed on their forearms. He said this was done on their arrival at their first concentration camp. Now, it was not only Jews who were tattooed at Auschwitz, although of course most of those with tattoos would have been Jews. Nevertheless, this, I think, remains evidence of Stewart's attempts to understand something beyond Belsen, some knowledge of the persecution, the experience faced by Jews before they got to Belsen. The use of the term first, I think, is interesting on that basis. Belsen was not simply a detention centre for political opponents, as many people saw it at the time, nor was Belsen the only camp where Jews suffered. And the deep empathy, which we've already seen Stewart demonstrated, led him to write with a bitter sense of irony and distaste for Nazi racial policy. Writing of 2-year-old Susie, whose photograph his report again reproduces, Stewart says, "She carried a tattooed number on her arm, doubtless to mark her down as a dangerous character and a menace to the glorious Third Reich. It was the will of the Nazi Party that this innocent mite should be branded for life because she failed to show the right discrimination in her choice of parents. Her crime was that they were Jewish." And in one testimony, Stewart told the story of a teenage boy called David. He was clearly deeply moved by his encounter with David and shared something of how David would sit and gaze out of the window and say nothing on his numerous visits to Stewart's office. And then Stewart said, "There does not seem to be any peace for the Davids of this world." Perhaps Stewart meant that there is no peace for children impacted by the horrors of war. But is there also a possibility that by extension, Stewart was saying that through his experience he had seen something of how there had been no peace for the Jews as a whole. Perhaps being a David himself, Stewart felt some sort of identification with this particular boy. Either way, it suggests a degree of solidarity with the survivor. Stewart was able to place himself alongside, to enter into empathy. And nowhere does Stewart, or indeed any of those Christian chaplains I have studied, exhibit evidence of anti-Semitism, use of anti-Jewish stereotypes, or attempts at missionizing, all things which, although not universally practiced by the church at the time, were nonetheless widespread. Stewart does not force his own faith on those he met, nor does he minimize their experiences or diminish their faith and identity. He respects them as who they are. And let's remind ourselves what he said when one Jewish survivor, whose story we heard a moment ago, Magda, told him that she thought that God himself has surely forgotten me. And Stewart responded, no, God has not forgotten you. Finally, this brings us to how chaplains responded to their experience. And chaplains were often determined to write up that experience so that others might know the truth of what they experienced. David Stewart published his own account as a 55-page pamphlet in July 1945, just a few weeks after his casualty clearing station left Belsen. In it, he wrote, "I shall tell only what I know is true. I shall tell it as far as is in me, with nothing of spite or vengefulness. I shall endeavour to make my pen the merest instrument in conveying to my public the things I've seen with my eyes and heard with my ears. In short, the barest truth." So what was it the chaplains wanted the world to know? Well, it was, particularly for Stewart, the truth of the stories of the survivors he met there. Stewart's account is full of the transcribed conversations he had with survivors. Time doesn't permit us to go into detail, but Stewart devotes 29 of 55 pages to those stories. 13 individual testimonies of Nazi persecution, mostly Jewish. Stewart provided names, dates of transports arriving at Auschwitz, details of those in their families who died and those who survived, transcripts of those people's responses, photographs, as you can see, of many of the survivors themselves and some of their experiences both before the war and after, and during, I should say. And note that they're not anonymous either. They are named people with stories, and those stories are shared in their own words. And these pages of Stewart's report are of huge importance, I think. They may not be the most detailed testimonies of the Holocaust we have. They're not recorded interviews, they're not published memoirs or professional oral histories. Nevertheless, they are amongst the very earliest attempts to record the experiences of camp survivors. David Stewart's work precedes by 3 months the founding of the first Jewish historical archive of survivor experiences in the British occupied zone of Germany, and by 12 months, the well-known and much-studied documentation work amongst displaced persons by David Boder. And Stewart's collected testimonies are therefore unique for their rawness, their proximity to events, and for the fact they are not recorded not by a fellow survivor, not by a Jew, but by a Christian who recognized just 1 month after Belsen's liberation the urgency and the value of preserving survivors' voices for the future. So we focused on just one Christian chaplain here, Reverend David Stewart. Stewart's trained to minister to soldiers, became a counsellor and a pastor to survivors of genocide. He sat and listened to the stories of the Jews from across Europe, and he recognized something of the specificity of Jewish experience and suffering. And finally, he recognized the imperative of telling the truth of what he witnessed. That's why he wrote down his experience, he published it, and he distributed it. And I've spoken to people still alive to this day who were children in his communities in England who still have their copies of this report that he gave to their families after the war. And in this way, I think his work at Belsen and the other chaplains was also conducted out of their deep Christian faith, because that commitment to memory and and to preserving truth and the lived experiences of people in a world that they had seen was so often plagued by a deliberate mistruth and the hatred behind those falsehoods, that was for them a radically defiant act of love in the aftermath of genocide. Stewart affirmed to his readers, "What I've written is true, so witness me, God." And because of that witness, Stewart's experience at Belsen and the lives and the stories, the faces and the names of those survivors to whom he ministered can be remembered, and above all, as memory and history, and above all, as truth.
Thank you so much, Rob, for sharing your very important and ongoing research with us. We now have time for questions, both for Rob and for John. I might start off with a question of my own while the rest of you gather your thoughts and put some questions for us in the chat, and I'll pick those up. And the question is for you, Rob, and it's something we've discussed, but I wondered whether you could just say a little bit more about why you think the responses of the chaplains were so different to those of the liberators and others who came in. You know, as you said, as John said, the excerpt that John, you read from your father's book, this very widespread situation of not recognizing the Jewishness of so many of these people, of the situation. What was it about the chaplains' experiences that led them to be able to recognize that Jewishness in such a distinctive and different way?
Thanks, Shirley. I think it mainly comes down to what chaplains did at Belsen and the length of time that they spent there. Not all of the chaplains, so I've studied a number of them, not every single one mentions the word Jew in their accounts. Most of them do. I think it depends on the nature of their work. David Stewart was came into the camp particularly that month later, and he was working in the hospital, he was meeting survivors, he was having those conversations. So he met them as people, he heard those stories, and he couldn't fail to recognize, I think, who they were. And those chaplains who didn't have those opportunities to meet survivors and have those lengthy conversations and relationships perhaps were more likely, and it goes for other liberators as well, not to recognize the identity of those survivors. Sometimes it depends on the nature of their works. Some of the Catholic chaplains at Belsen encountered large numbers of Catholics in the camps, whether they were former Polish prisoners of war, Poles who had been transported there from other camps in Poland, French and Belgians and other Western Europeans who happened to have been brought to Belsen. There were a number of Catholics. So there were masses held in the first few days after. So some of those Catholic chaplains don't really talk about Jews, but talk about the Catholics that they met. And I think that's understandable because those are the people that they felt a real urgent need to minister to in those early days, to administer the last rites before those people died, for example. But fundamentally, I think compared to the church back at home, who really did not recognize the Jewishness of the experience, it was the fact that the chaplains saw Belsen for themselves and met those survivors for themselves. And particularly for our interest this evening, one of the most important factors in that understanding was their relationship with Jewish chaplains, with John's father and with Leslie Hardman, the other particularly prominent chaplain at work in Belsen. Leslie Hardman in his memoir writes very movingly of the first burial, and I saw in the chat some people asking about those burials. I hope I'm not anticipating a question, but Hardman writes, that the vast majority of almost all of those victims who were already dead, no one knew who they were. There were no records of who these people were, so they had to be buried in mass anonymous graves. And prayers were said by both Jewish and Christian chaplains. And Leslie Hardman writes very movingly of approaching a grave, and a Protestant chaplain, sadly we don't know which one, but a Protestant chaplain coming up alongside him, and Leslie Harmon invites the Protestant chaplain to say a Christian prayer first. And the Protestant chaplain says, no, I think you should go first, because most of the people here are your people, they are Jews, and it is you who should go first. And I think that encounter with their colleagues, their ministerial colleagues, their chaplaincy colleagues, was a big factor as well in helping chaplains to understand who exactly these people were.
Thanks, Rob. So we have a few questions. I'll start with one from Caroline Slifkin, which really is both for you, Rob, and for John. John, specifically, I suppose, about your father. Did any chaplains struggle with their own faith, either at the time or later in their lives?
I think the answer is no. This is a remarkable thing, that the individuals who went into the field must have had a certain inner robustness that they could basically address these issues without losing their personal integrity, their faith or their integrity or their health. In parenthesis, though, I must tell you that Leslie, who was an extraordinarily robust and lovely guy, for a period was withdrawn from Belsen because he was so traumatized by what he'd seen that he was running around the camp as a chaplain or with a pistol in a holster. No chaplain was allowed to carry arms, and the British authorities demanded that he be withdrawn for a while. But Leslie never faltered in his personal faith, and he regained his composure.
Thanks, John.
I think there's probably largely the same for the Christian chaplains as well. I mean, I've spoken to relatives of some of those chaplains, and they, although are largely unable to comment on, you know, their father or their grandfather's personal emotional responses, because often they didn't talk about it to their relatives, they are all very clear about the strong faith that their fathers had, the incredible impact that they had on their local communities. And I know the same is can be said for Isaac Levy and Leslie Harmon as well in their communities in London. But those Christian chaplains, they came back to the UK, they went back into ministry. But that's not to say that they didn't struggle with the trauma of what they experienced. They remain Christian ministers, but they did often struggle. I've read letters of one of the Catholic chaplains who in the 1950s during the Korean War, desperate, he was sent to by the Jesuit order to Australia, where he clearly really struggled to settle after the war. And he was desperate during the Korean War to re-enlist as an army chaplain. And very sadly, his superiors felt that he'd become a bit of a maverick, a bit of a loose cannon, and he wasn't permitted to do so. David Stewart, who we've spoken about this evening, compared to most of the other chaplains, was older than the others. He was born in 1890, so he was in his early 50s, which was, you know, a lot older than the other chaplains, most of whom were in their late 20s, early 30s, or mid to late 30s. And he died in the late 1950s, in 1956, I think, in quite sad circumstances. He moved from Suffolk to Herefordshire, to the Welsh borders, and very sadly died a few days after a tragic incident involving a little girl in the village who was tragically killed by a milk lorry, and he was pulled from his sickbed, and he died a couple of days after the funeral of this little girl, which is recorded in a local history of the village. So trauma was never far from reality, sadly, even if they did continue in their ministries.
Thanks, Rob. So we have a question from Peter Houston. Hello, Peter. Nice that you're here. Did the Reverend Stewart and other Christian chaplains continue post-war to engage with Jewish communities back in the UK? And I suppose we can pose this question to John too, whether your father had any contact with or connections with Christian chaplains once they were all back in the UK.
if I jump in now, I can say I have no recollection of any such contacts. But it is very possible that since my father continued as the senior chaplain to Jewish men in the forces for several decades afterwards, maybe professionally he met them, but that wasn't raised in family discussions around the table.
Although, of course, your father did go on to be incredibly involved in interfaith relations more generally in this country and worldwide, John. But for the Christian chaplains, again, I don't have any evidence that they, well, I do. I mean, I do in the sense that the daughters of one of the Christian chaplains have told me that he was in touch with one of the Jewish chaplains from Belsen for the rest of his life. Sadly, many of his papers were destroyed on his death, so I don't know whether that was Leslie or Isaac. I think it was Leslie, but Leslie Harmon. But it's interesting that we do have evidence of those interactions in the camp, and that certainly informed their experiences. And John's father wrote a report about Belsen, which was distributed to members of the armed forces of the Jewish faith in very soon after the liberation. And actually their superior, the Assistant Chaplain General of the British Second Army, sent that report alongside the report of one of the Christian chaplains written in the camp in the first few days, sent them together to every serving chaplain in the British Army. So every chaplain, whether Christian or Jewish, received not just a report about Belsen, but a Christian and a Jewish one alongside one another, which I think is an interesting image. And I have spoken to the family of one chaplain who, although he didn't encounter Belsen himself, kept those reports for the rest of his life, and they still have those in their possession. So that was clearly a big influence on many people.
Thanks. So a question from Carolyn, and this is, Rob, I think directed at this idea that you presented, that the chaplains were so focused on the Jewishness of survivors. And she asks whether the chaplains, whether you have any evidence that they met together or talked about as a group how to treat Jewish survivors. Do you have any evidence to that effect, or did they come up with these approaches as individuals?
And I don't necessarily have evidence of them discussing Jewish survivors together, but certainly chaplains work together in the camp. And Stewart writes particularly of his Christian colleague, the Reverend T.J. Davies, who they worked together. They basically decided together that they were going to focus on this kind of pastoral care, and they spoke to their commanding officer and said, we're going to do this, and he gave them effectively an office out of which they could operate. Other Christian chaplains did very similar things. A Church of Scotland chaplain, who was the one who maintained contact with a Jewish chaplain for the rest of his life, he writes about sharing that office with one of the Jewish chaplains and working together and actually relying on the Jewish chaplain who could speak some Yiddish to act as a translator with the survivors. So there was definitely this interaction. Many of the chaplains write about meeting together as a group at the end of the day to discuss the experience. We can assume to say prayers and to divvy up the tasks of the day. So we can only assume that they discussed patient experience as well.
Thanks, Rob. So we also have in the chat a question from Mary Klook, who is the director of the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center. And Mary, I don't know if you are still with us, but I wonder whether I could invite you to ask the question, because I wonder whether you wanted to say something about Rabbi Richards or what you know about him. I'll give you a sec to go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shirley, and thank you to both the speakers. And it's been a fabulous evening, and I've thoroughly, I found it moving, and I've never, as much as I've done a fair amount of research about Jewish chaplains, I'd never come across this aspect of the Christian chaplains in the camps, which has been enlightening and very poignant. I've had dealings, and we've just produced a short documentary about Rabbi Isaac Richards, who spent, he died in his late 90s and was in Durban for many of those, his latter years as the rabbi. And I wondered if either of you had come across him in any of your research or personally.
I'm afraid I have not.
Okay. He arrived at Bergen-Belsen apparently on the 8th of May and spent 18 months in Germany supporting Jewish prisoners and victims post the liberation. So I just wondered, it would be wonderful if we had any more research or access to information about him. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. I haven't. I'd love to see the documentary because it would be fascinating to hear more about your research. Sadly, I haven't heard of Isaac Richards, but the person who could tell us, as Peter has just put in the chat, is Jonathan Lewis, who has just completed his PhD on Jewish chaplaincy in the British Army. So we could put you in touch with Jonathan if that would be helpful, Mary. But I'd be very interested to learn more.
Thank you. That'll be
Mary,
great.
was Isaac Richards British? Just to clarify, he was British and then came to South Africa afterwards.
Yes, he was from Liverpool, and moved in pretty much in late 46, arrived in South Africa.
Thank you. And Tully has also put a message in the chat asking which prayers were recited next to the mass graves.
I suspect, I mean, this is a guess, that Leslie basically did the Kaddish and a shortened form of the funeral oration, a sort of a general prayer. It wouldn't have been a fully fledged service per se.
The same is true, I think, for the Christian chaplains who would have done some form of a Christian burial. Again, a vastly different experience to what they were trained to do. They were trained and instructed as chaplains as far as possible to have individual burials for individual service people, to record the name of the person they were burying. So this was a vastly different situation. There is an account of an address, and part of my research now, as I'm carrying on, is to look at other camps to compare the British experience of chaplaincy with the experience of American chaplaincy and Canadian chaplaincy at other camps liberated in 45. And there was an American chaplain at Vobelin, a satellite camp, who made an address effectively to the soldiers who had helped liberate, as well as local German townspeople, and that address was published in the Christian press in the United States. So yeah, it's quite interesting to look at that as well as the prayers that were said.
We have a couple more questions. I think I might just pose all of them and then kind of draw a line under those, and maybe if you want to answer them as a group. One of the questions was about communication, the ways in which the chaplains were able to communicate with prisoners at the camp. Were there translation services, or did they basically rely on their German to English dictionaries, or indeed Yiddish to English dictionaries? Carolyn asks about Shabbat. Were there services? What was Jewish life like? Which I suspect is a large question if one considers Bergen-Belsen as a DP camp after the liberation. Kim asks, how much time did the chaplains spend at Bergen-Belsen? Which is a great question. So I'm throwing all of those out to you, and after that we will do our closing. Go ahead, Rob.
Was the last one, how much time did the chaplains spend at Bergen-Belsen?
Yes.
Yeah. So to answer that one first, that varied particularly. So John could elaborate on both Isaac and Leslie's kind of well, we've heard some of their interactions with these kind of intransigent British soldier civil servants, and they were able to kind of manipulate their orders in a way so that they could spend as much time at Belsen as possible. Many of the Christian chaplains kind of moved on with their units, with their hospitals, and they would spend several weeks, a month, maybe more at Belsen, and hospitals would be moved on to other places. And there were chaplains that I've studied who didn't encounter the camp itself, but were working in a British military hospital, maybe 70 kilometers away, but to where survivors from Belsen were moved. And so they encountered people who had spent time in Belsen, although not at the camp. David Stewart spent about 6 weeks, I think, if I remember correctly, at Belsen before being moved on. Some of the chaplains were just there for a day. Belsen, as we heard in Isaac Levy's letter from his first encounter, that it became a kind of spectacle very quickly. People went there to see what, see if the stories were true. And there were some chaplains who did that as well, and I've read some of their accounts. In terms of communication, that's a really interesting and important question. Some of the chaplains could speak some German. Some of them spoke French. And so there were some survivors and former inmates who had some French. And so that became the kind of language of intercession. Some of them relied on their Jewish colleagues. Some of the survivors, of course, spoke English and were able to become, especially those who were healthier, who'd arrived later at Belsen, closer to the liberation, who were able to help in the medical care. Some of those people were able to act as translators. And I think there was clearly a lot of kind of personal interaction, a lot of, simply from being alongside for that amount of time, you can get a sense that with a bit of German phraseology, Stewart, and a bit of care, Stewart was able to make himself understood. In terms of Jewish religious life, John might want to say a little bit more. I mean, there are incredibly moving recordings of, I think, the first Shabbat service in Belsen, as well as the singing of Hatikva and other experiences. There are photographs of the first weddings, and very famously in the UK, the first wedding between with Gina Turgle, who was one of the survivors of Belsen, who came to Britain and married a British Jewish soldier liberator. These became very famous images. And of course, the story of Jewish life and revival at Belsen as it became a DP centre. It was the centre of Jewish life in British occupied Germany. That is a huge question. I don't know if John wants to say anything about it.
Okay. So to address the three issues, I mean, as far as my dad was concerned, he came from Polish Jewish stock, so he had fluent Yiddish. He'd been in the Middle East for 3 years. And so his Ivrit, which was pretty barren on arrival in 41, was very fluent by 44. So he had Hebrew and he had Broken Biscuits German as well. So he had languages with which he could communicate to the bulk of people there. You will appreciate that at the outset, the two principals, Dad, Leslie, and others, were actually on primary attachment as army chaplains with a responsibility to fighting units. So Belsen represented a sort of a secondary factor in terms of their assignment. It was as the weeks went by that others then became drafted in to work sort of continuously and provide service within the camp. I can't tell you the total number of Jewish chaplains that were there by the time the camp was fired, or as far as the DP camp is concerned. That's a piece of research we need to do. But it clearly became the case that as the survivors gained strength, then all the diverse elements within Jewry emerged, from voices that were completely secular to those that were ultra-Orthodox. The ultra-Orthodox clearly would have wanted services according to the law, as it were, and the chaplains were there to furnish all those services on Shabbatot, on Saturdays and festivals and so on, and to provide succor to the learning centers within the DP camp. Again, I haven't got an enormous amount of data on this. More research needed.
Just to add very quickly before we, Shirley, is that I've just been flicking through Isaac Levy's book, which John shared at the beginning. I don't know if Mary, if you're still there, if you've got a copy of Isaac's book, or if you're able to get a copy, because he does talk about Reverend Richards, who arrived. He writes about his arrival and says he did a superb job throughout the period of his stay in Germany, which wasn't universal in Isaac Levy's judgment of all the Jewish chaplains. So I think
that's great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I don't know if you're able to get a copy, Mary, or I can.
I shouldn't plug this. It's not available as a hard copy, but it is available as an ebook through Halban Publishers.
Thank you. I might just put, Mary, I might put you in touch with Rob and John, also so that they can connect you with Jonathan Lewis, another former student in our department who's done his research on chaplains. And John, I just noticed as you were speaking that your dad is perched on the bookshelf behind you, a lovely photograph of him. So it's nice that he's been with us here through this talk. And I will hand over at this point to Tully to close the evening.
Thank you so much, Shelly, and thank you so much, Rob and John. Wow, we learned so much. It was absolutely a fantastic way to start the year of learning about things that we really do not know enough about. And you enriched us. You gave us so much to think about. John, maybe if you can put in the chat, or Rob, the name of the book of your father, John, and any other resources. I saw that Peter was putting some resources. It would be great. And really thank you for partnering, for the St. Martin Gilbert Learning Centre and the University College London for partnering with the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre tonight in this fantastic webinar. And we had with us, I just saw Kim Magid from New York that joined us. Her grandmother, Leah Herman, survived Auschwitz and then survived Bergen-Belsen and was so sick that as a 12-year-old, a teenager was taken to Sweden, to get treatment in hospitals. And this is another story, that we did not spend time, and there's so many stories that we can talk about. So thank you all for joining us, and we look very much forward to invite you to join us again on the 19th of January, next week, Tuesday, to do something totally different and learn something about Soweto and South African human rights. Thank you, Rob, John, Shirley, and good night to everyone. Keep safe and have a very good 2021.